Entering the 2024 race, the Biden-Harris ticket projected a pristine public image of Democratic unity. But beneath that polished surface, the foundation was fracturing from the inside out. Biden's inner circle spent years actively suppressing the vice president's accomplishments. To the president's top advisors, the math was simple. If she appeared too successful, it might diminish his own standing and legacy. This internal rivalry carried a heavy strategic cost. Instead of building independent political capital, Harris spent months trapped in a defensive cycle, forced to continually prove her loyalty to an administration that viewed her as a threat. When Harris faced unfair public attacks, the White House largely withheld its massive media resources. The administration had the tools to debunk the misinformation, but they chose not to deploy them for their own vice president. By the time Biden stepped aside, Harris had to launch her campaign from within a hole her own party had spent years digging. That internal friction collided with public reality on the Atlanta debate stage in June. Watching the broadcast from a hotel room in Los Angeles, Harris saw what her team had tried to manage behind closed doors. The president was struggling to find his words, and his body language made it clear he didn't want to be in the competition. The immediate establishment response was to gaslight the electorate. Democratic surrogates flooded the airwaves to frame the performance as a standard political stumble, ignoring the systemic failure the world had just witnessed. Even after the collapse, the president's focus remained internal. Just before Harris's own debate, Biden called her, not to offer support, but to complain about rumors that political operatives in Pennsylvania were speaking poorly of him. The administration continued to deny the severity of what the public had seen, even as the fallout from the debate became impossible to contain. The image of capability vanished that night. When Biden finally exited the race, Harris was left with exactly 107 days to salvage an institutional catastrophe. Working-class Americans were facing a harsh economic reality. Inflation was driving grocery prices up, and the threat of widespread tariffs promised to freeze domestic manufacturing and raise the cost of living even further. Simultaneously, conservative groups were preparing to implement a decades-old agenda. Organizations like the Heritage Foundation were finalizing Project 2025, a plan to dismantle public education and restructure the federal government. While citizens worried about losing healthcare coverage, the opposition's priorities remained clear. Donald Trump spent his energy promising his wealthiest allies he would build gilded ballrooms for their social circles, while cutting services everyone else relied on. Harris centered her sprint on these tangible issues, attempting to force a logical debate on startup tax credits, child tax extensions, and home health care for seniors. But a policy-driven campaign only works if the electorate is still paying attention to the facts, a dangerous assumption to make in the modern media landscape. The opposition bypassed traditional policy arguments entirely, opting instead for calculated psychological misdirection. On the debate stage, Trump amplified a baseless internet rumor about Haitian immigrants in Ohio eating their neighbors' pets. This diagram shows how absurdity overrides policy. As outrageous claims expand, they consume the media's bandwidth, leaving no room for Harris's actual plans. This strategy targets a specific neurological vulnerability. Fear-based rhetoric bypasses the rational prefrontal cortex and hits the brain's emotional center, the amygdala. The fear of the outrageous becomes more memorable than the logic of the practical. Targeted disinformation campaigns further amplified this effect, specifically bombarding demographics that already had reasons to distrust the government with emotional falsehoods. By short-circuiting the electorate's attention span, the opposition rendered logical arguments invisible. On election night, the theoretical strategies of the campaign collided with the finality of raw data. This counter shows the mathematical reality that hit the war room. The incoming numbers showed Harris was short by exactly 200,000 votes, with no remaining path to victory on the map. That deficit reflected a refusal to adapt. While Trump sat for hours on alternative media platforms like Joe Rogan, the Harris campaign skipped those massive audiences, clinging to traditional media while millions of independent voters were listening elsewhere. When the realization hit, Harris fell into a state of shock, later describing the political loss as a form of grief, as paralyzing as the death of her own mother. She spent the morning of the aftermath forcing back tears. Instead of the victory celebration she had planned, she walked onto the stage at Howard University to deliver a concession speech to a mourning crowd. The 200,000 vote deficit represents the final cost of institutional ego and a failure to engage with the reality of modern psychological warfare.